Today, I'm going to talk about trust. I'm sure you all have a relationship to trust. I want you to taste the word. How does it feel? What comes into your mind? Moments where somebody has shown trust in you? Or maybe you trusted somebody? Did that person respond with benevolence? Or did he or she let you down? Maybe somebody showed you mistrust. Take a few seconds and taste the word trust. One of my earliest memories of trust is when I got my own key. I think I was 7 years old. "We trust you," my parents said. "We think you can take responsibility, lock the door, and not get rid of the key." Wow, what a sense of freedom. I think I grew several inches in that moment. I felt myself almost adult. I can do anything now when I have my own key. And I sure did. I locked the door. I came home the time we had agreed on. I didn't lose the key. Well, maybe more than a few times. But most importantly, the trust that my parents showed me gave me self-confidence and made me dare to explore new things. Trust makes people grow. Years went by. I grew up and I started my own career. I didn't think, write, or talk about trust. I thought, wrote, and talked about incentives and control. I became a labor economist. Economics is about getting the incentives right. Empirical economics is about studying the consequences of the incentives. If we increase the unemployment benefits, what happens with employment? If we do the same thing with sickness benefits, what happens to sickness absence? These are typical questions for an economist. So how on earth did I choose to talk about trust today? Well, let me tell you. As a PhD student and many years thereafter, I spent my days evaluating active labor market policies. Various kinds of labor market training or subsidized employment that are provided for unemployed people and are supposed to strengthen their position at the labor market. That is, to get a good job as quickly as possible. There was this puzzle that me and my economist colleagues repeatedly punched into. The results that we found weren't the intended, the expected ones. Job chances of the participants did not improve, at least not much. In fact, some of my own studies showed negative effects. Sometimes the group that did participate wasn't the intended target group. Programs were given to individuals who were rather strong at the labor market, rather than those who are the weakest one and supposed to get the help. So what was wrong? Was it the policy design? Or was it something else? What happened from the political decision to the very meeting between the caseworker and the participant? To be honest, me and my economist colleagues, we weren't too interested in the organization and the implementation chain. For us, in economics, we sometimes call it the black box. So what we did was we speculated that something went wrong within the black box. Probably the employees weren't controlled detailed enough to do the right thing. The incentives were wrong. So my guess was that just designing more sophisticated incentives and tougher control should fix it. Well, more years went by. I got more and more interested in seeing the world outside the university and explore my own leadership skills. So I got my first job as a head of research, then a second one, and then a third, and definitely the most challenging one. For about 7 years ago, I entered Försäkringskassan, the Swedish Agency for Social Insurance, a huge government agency administrating one of the crown jewelry of the welfare state, the publicly financed compulsory social insurance. Sickness benefits, early retirement benefits, parental insurance, and so on. 13,000 employees, taking care of a budget of about 200 billion Swedish crowns. Huge. And also, one of the black boxes that I had been speculating about. Wow, I was inside a black box. I got the job as a head of research, and a member of the Director General's management team. My own team of about 80 analysts were true experts in studying the social insurance system. But opposite to my economist colleagues at the university, these guys were truly interested in understanding what happens within the agency when new signals come from the government or the top management team at the agency. So steadily, my own understanding about the black box started to grow. And oh boy, it was more complicated than I had realized. I'll give you an example. It's about consequences of time limits and quantitative goals. What happens if you introduce a time limit that's at a certain share of cases, say 80%, must be handled within the time limit? One of the big issues in these kind of organizations is the turnaround time. How long do people who have sent in an application for a benefit have to wait until the decision? Well, too long is often the answer. That was the case at Försäkringskassan as well. The government got frustrated and told the agency to work more quickly. Well, it didn't help, so government raised its voice, saying, "You must make commitments to the people. It's not okay that they have to wait so long." Well, said and done, so-called service commitments were introduced. That is, the agency committed itself to a time limit, a certain number of days when all the cases should be handled. 120 days for the more complicated cases, such as early retirement or complicated benefits, and a shorter time limit for a bit less complicated benefits. So what happened? Well, my analysts would tell, we had data on all the cases, we knew the dates of the application, we knew the dates of the decision. After these service commitments were introduced, the average time to complete a case was in fact shortened. So yes, the service commitments had the intended effects on average. But what we also could see is that there was this huge peak only a few days before the deadline. So the caseworkers were really, really keen on ending the cases in time. What happened to a case, a citizen behind that case, that wasn't ended in time? Nothing. No, at least not for a very long time. In fact, the tail of the distribution got very long, so relatively more cases got to be very long. Why? Recall that there was this very strong incentives to have a certain high share of cases ended in time. This incentive got to be very important in the management chain. So every manager along the hierarchy understood that we must have a high completion rate. So a caseworker who did its share, 80% of the cases in time, was a hero. A head of a unit with many caseworkers with high completion rates was a hero. A head of a department with many units with many cases, yeah, you know what I'm getting. These time limits were measured and controlled frequently and in detail. This meant that the only rational thing, if a case started to exceed the time limit, was to drop it as quickly as possible and to take a new case. So the caseworkers were really keen on ending the cases in time. So in fact, the best thing was to try to pick as many easy cases as possible from the beginning, meaning that individuals a bit with more complicated cases, maybe complicated sickness history, were at risk of having to wait for a very, very, very long time for the decision. Maybe those individuals who really needed the help most. I realized two things. One, this is crazy. This is not good. Controlling in such a detailed way and letting the overall goal just flow through the whole management chain into detailed individual goals on a caseworker level was not good. Two, this was far from the only example. There were very many more. In fact, I realized that me and my economist colleagues were not the only ones with a strong and more or less sole focus on incentives and control. Politicians, civil servants, managers, steering these public organizations, social service, schools, all kinds of public organizations, believed very strongly in incentives and control as well. Since the 1980s, this has in fact been the key component in the public sector. The development is sometimes referred to as new public management. So the well-meaning aim of this kind of steering was to increase the efficiency of the public sector. Ironically, the result wasn't at all efficient all the times. Fortunately, new winds were starting to blow. I heard the word trust. The government was concerned for the low public trust towards Försäkringskassan and the social insurance system. So the focus in steering the agency started to slowly move from this kind of detailed quantitative goals, such as service commitments, to increasing trust. And the need of understanding how got to be very urgent. Fortunately, again, my analyst could help. We went through the existing literature on trust and organizations, and we gathered large data. One key insight was that if you want to increase the public trust, you must show trust also within the organization. Meaning that instead of steering in such a detailed way, you must give the employees more autonomy. You must give the employees chances to use their own knowledge and experience, their mastery in doing the job. So what would this mean in the example that I just gave you? Well, instead of doing the way they did, they should have made it more possible for the employees to choose the way of working. Understand that the employees probably know what's stopping them from working more efficiently. In this kind of environment, in another kind of environment, also more complicated cases would be handled. So we wouldn't see this kind of results. But if this is done in a correct way, you see a totally other kind of systems. But you must understand that the employees must be given the autonomy to challenge the existing processes and to be able to change them. So I think the management should have 3 key insights here. The first is that it's nothing wrong to be very, very clear on the overall goal. In this case, people shouldn't be waiting too long for their decision. But it is wrong to let it just rain down the organization, become detailed individual goals. The second insight they should get is that the reason for the queues is not that people are lazy and do not want to do a good work. It's probably that the processes and the organization is too complicated. Inefficient systems create inefficient behavior. The third insight would be that the managers should realize that it's the employees, not the top management, that knows how to improve the processes. The managers just must give the employees space to do it. Of all the 120 days that it took to handle, say, early retirement, only a few days were used for processing. The rest of the days were some kind of transfer, where one caseworker handles the case to another. And every time you do that, the risk of misunderstanding and mistakes increase, and time goes, and the case gets longer. So changing the system requires, the steering requires trust. The managers must trust that the employees know how to do the work, and the managers, most importantly, must trust that the employees have the ability to challenge and improve the processes if they are given the possibility. In 2016, I switched jobs again. I got a phone call from the Swedish government. We want to reform the steering and management of the whole public sector. Are you available? What? Yeah, we believe that incentives and control are not the only one, the best way to make sure that the public sector works efficiently towards the citizens. We want you to lead a group of experts that gathers researchers and people from the public sector organization to develop and promote a new kind of management. So was the Delegation for Trust-Based Public Management born, and suddenly I had the best job ever. Together with a large team of researchers, and in tight cooperation with street-level bureaucrats, managers, politicians, we've developed a framework for understanding how trust-based management works. And our knowledge and conclusions are based on several good examples from practice where this has been done. Take the social services for elderly in Sundsvall, a middle-sized city in northern Sweden. For a couple of years ago, an inquiry among the elderly in Sundsvall showed that they really didn't appreciate the support and service they got from the municipality. In fact, they thought the quality was really lousy. Employees said basically the same thing about working environment. So sickness absence was high, and many were searching for new jobs. Something had to be done. Now, the top management of the social services did something very clever and very brave. Instead of rushing into conclusions, pushing the organization harder, or simply recruiting some more social workers to fix the thing, they instead said, okay, maybe we should ask the employees what to do. So they get the employees and the elderly. So they gathered the employees around the problem, the fact that the elderly didn't appreciate the service, and told them to study the problem deeper and come back with new ideas of how to organize the work. The managers and the politicians took a step back, held their hands patiently behind their back, and gave the employees space and time. An investment, yes, but it paid back. So the employees gathered around the problem, interviewed the elderly, studied, analyzed, discussed. They got new, sometimes quite painful insights, how crazy the process looked like from the elderly's perspective. They started sketching a new ways of working. They tested their ideas with the elderly, refined them, tested them again. They read the law book, checking that their ideas were okay. And after a few months, they came back to the managers and said, well, now we think we know how we want to work. Among other things, they asked for a permanent mandate to plan for the time schedules and other details in the processes. Now, this was a crucial moment for the managers. Now they must really act quickly and respond. They must show action and start changing the steering, the organization, the management according to these ideas. Social services in Sundsvall did so, and this became a success. So what's happening now, in fact, is that they have invited other parts of the municipality, other parts of the welfare system to join them in this way of developing. So it is possible to do it like this. Keywords for this kind of management are openness and trust among the employees, managers, politicians. Taking the citizen's perspective, a holistic perspective, and autonomy, knowledge accumulation, and a supportive attitude. And these 7 principles are in fact the guiding principles, the core of trust-based management. Guys on the highest ladders must understand the advantages. They must be willing to change the system and change themselves. My experience is that places where the politicians and the top management have really shaken hand and committed themselves to trust, great things start happening. As I said already, the guys closest to the citizens quite often have a good hunch on what's stopping them from doing the work in a good way. But this message does not get through. So as long as the middle management sees its role as to listening upwards, giving orders and controlling downwards, the message doesn't get through. So in order to change the culture and the structure, the top management must be clear. And they must show a good example. Enhancing openness, dialogue, seeing its main role to tell what should be done, the overall goal, instead of saying how the work should be done. Well, where does this leave me? I promised to share my understanding for how public sector works. I'm still an economist. I still believe incentives matter. But I also strongly believe that I'm a better economist now when I know more about the black box. And when I know that autonomy and mastery matter too, besides incentives and control. I'm humble enough to realize that we economists own a great power and thus responsibility. Very often we have the politician's ear. That's why we should choose our recommendations carefully. And that's why we also should show interest in understanding the practice and balancing incentives and control with intrinsic motivation and trust. Trust makes people grow. Thank you for showing me trust by listening to me. I think I grew a couple of inches again.